Hey everyone, welcome back. So, you know how we're always drawn to certain faces? Like there's just something about them that catches our eye?
Right. We all have those moments where we think, wow, they're striking.
Exactly. And it turns out there's a whole world of science behind why that happens.
Uh,
I've been digging into a mountain of research on facial attractiveness.
and it's not just about personal opinions, right? We're talking about real hard science here.
Totally. It's like we think we know what we find attractive, but what's really going on in our brains? What are the underlying mechanisms?
It's a fascinating stuff. We're talking biology, psychology, even anthropology, and cutting edge technology all coming together to help us understand this.
That's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're going to look at the evolutionary roots of attraction, the role of individual features like those captivating eyes or a strong jawline.
Right. And we can't forget the impact of skin health.
Oh yeah, complexion is huge. And then there's the whole cultural side of things and how our own minds play tricks on us.
Exactly. Get ready for some serious aha moments as we go through all of this.
So to kick things off, let's go way back to the beginning, to the biological and evolutionary foundations of attraction. Like, why are we even drawn to certain faces in the first place?
Well, from an evolutionary perspective, think of attractiveness as a signal. It's like a billboard advertising good qualities in a potential mate.
Qualities like.
Things like good health, strong genes, the potential for healthy offspring, all those things that would have been super important for our ancestors' survival.
So basically, it's not just random, it's tied to our instinct to reproduce and keep the species going.
Exactly. And one specific example is the idea that we might be drawn to features that signal resistance to parasites. It's like on a subconscious level, we're picking up on cues that say, hey, this person's got a robust immune system.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
A healthy partner means healthy kids. And the crazy thing is, there's this amazing consistency in what people find attractive across different cultures.
Yeah, you see that in study after study. People from all over the world tend to agree on which faces are attractive, even when judging faces from ethnicities they've never seen before.
Like, even if they've never been exposed to those features before, they still find certain faces more appealing. It's almost like it's hardwired into us.
And there's even more mind-blowing research with babies, literally just weeks old. They already show a preference for looking at faces that adults rate as attractive.
Wow. Babies with a built-in beauty radar. That's incredible. But the research also brings up this other idea, right? That maybe our preferences for certain faces are also tied to how our brains just process information in general.
Right, it's not necessarily all about mate selection. It could be that our brains are just wired to find certain visual patterns more pleasing and easier to process. Like maybe we're just attracted to what's visually efficient.
It makes you wonder how much of it is nature versus nurture, right?
For sure. And speaking of brains, there's a ton of research on what actually happens in our brains when we see a face we find attractive.
Okay, so like what's firing up there?
Well, we know the fusiform face area, the part of the brain specialized for recognizing faces, gets activated. But what's really interesting is that areas associated with the brain's reward system also light up.
The reward system. So
Yeah.
like the same part of the brain that gets activated by, say, eating a delicious meal.
Exactly. It's like our brain is saying, this is good, keep looking.
Yeah.
And the speed at which this happens is amazing. We're talking split-second judgments, like a tenth of a second.
So we're making these assessments about attractiveness super fast without even realizing it. Okay, so we've talked about the evolutionary and biological underpinnings.
Hmm.
Now let's get into the specifics of facial features. Starting with symmetry, we've all heard that symmetry is key.
Right. Facial symmetry, meaning how well the two sides of the face mirror each other, is a big one. The main idea is that it reflects developmental stability.
Like how well someone was able to develop in the face of environmental challenges or genetic hiccups.
Yeah, a symmetrical face might signal that someone has good genes and is more resilient to those challenges.
So in a way, symmetry could be a sign of overall good health and genetic fitness. And studies have shown a link between symmetry and perceived attractiveness, right?
Definitely. But here's the thing, it's not as simple as perfect symmetry equals maximum attractiveness.
Oh, interesting. So a perfectly symmetrical face might actually be less appealing.
Some studies actually suggest that. Maybe a bit of natural asymmetry makes a face more unique and interesting. Plus, there's debate about whether symmetry is the main driver or if it's just that symmetrical faces often happen to have other attractive features as well.
Gotcha. So it's not the whole story, but definitely a piece of the puzzle. Now, what about facial proportions? We've all heard about the golden ratio, this magical number that supposedly holds the key to beauty. Does that really apply to faces?
The golden ratio, yeah, that proportion of roughly 1 to 1.618. It's been associated with beauty for centuries, and some studies do show a connection between facial proportions that align with this ratio and perceived attractiveness.
But it's not a hard and fast rule.
Right. Right. Some researchers are even talking about new golden ratios based on average facial measurements. For example, the distance between the eyes and the mouth relative to the face's length, or the distance between the eyes relative to the face's width.
So it's not just about this one magical number,
Yay.
but about overall balance and proportions that are close to the average.
Exactly. And it ties back to that idea of cognitive averaging we talked about earlier, where we're drawn to faces that resemble the average of all the faces we've seen.
Like familiar is comfortable and therefore more attractive.
Exactly. But again, it's important to remember that these ratios aren't the be-all and end-all. Faces that deviate from them can still be incredibly attractive. Individual features play a huge role, and cultural preferences come into play too.
Totally. All right, let's dive into those individual features, starting with the eyes, often called the windows to the soul. What makes for attractive eyes, scientifically speaking?
Well, one thing that stands out is size. Generally speaking, larger eyes are seen as more attractive across different cultures.
Why do you think that is?
It could be that larger eyes are associated with youthfulness. You know, those neotenous features that trigger a nurturing response.
Like a baby's big, innocent eyes.
Exactly. But it's not just about size, right? There's also shape. Almond-shaped eyes, round eyes, hooded eyes. They all have their own appeal.
And each shape kind of projects a different vibe, like elegance or youthfulness or even mystery.
Totally. Almond-shaped eyes, though, are often considered universally appealing, probably because they're seen as having really balanced proportions.
Interesting. Now, I've always wondered about eye color. Does that really matter when it comes to attractiveness?
It might not be as crucial as we think. Research suggests that things like the brightness of the sclera, the white part of the eye, and the size of the pupil could be more important.
Oh, really? So it's more about the whites being clear and bright and the pupils being
Dilated, perhaps, which can signal interest and engagement.
fascinating. All right, let's move on to the lips.
Okay.
What makes for a set of kissable lips, according to science?
Well, you guessed it. The golden ratio pops up again. There's this idea that a ratio of 1 to 1.6 for the upper to lower lip is ideal, especially in studies of Caucasian women. But, as with everything else, there are variations in preferences across genders, generations, and cultures.
So it's not just about one magic number.
Right. Lip symmetry is important, as is fullness, and how the lips are proportioned relative to the rest of the face.
And speaking of cultural variations, I remember reading that lip preferences can differ quite a bit around the world.
Absolutely. For example, research shows that surgeons in Asia, or those of non-Caucasian ethnicity, often favor larger lips in their work, while those in Europe and Caucasian surgeons tend to favor smaller lips. And then if you look at the general public living in Asia, there's often a preference for the smallest lips.
Wow, so much variation. But one thing seems consistent. Natural-looking lips are usually preferred over those that look overly plumped.
Yes, going overboard with enhancements can actually backfire and make lips appear less attractive.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the jawline and chin. What makes a jawline attractive?
A well-defined jawline is often associated with youthfulness and attractiveness in both men and women, but as you might expect, there are gender differences in the ideal shape.
So, what considered attractive for men versus women?
For men, a more angular and prominent jawline, that chiseled look, is usually seen as more attractive. It projects strength and masculinity.
Makes sense.
While for women, a softer, more rounded jawline is generally preferred. It's associated with femininity and youthfulness.
It all goes back to those sexually dimorphic features that distinguish men and women. And interestingly, the research mentioned that even chin shape preferences can vary geographically.
Yes, there are regional differences in what's considered an attractive chin. For example, populations in Australia tend to have less projecting chins compared to other groups.
Ah, who knew? Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with individual features. Now let's talk about a huge factor in attractiveness: skin health and complexion.
Absolutely, skin quality is crucial. You know, smooth, clear skin without blemishes and a nice even tone, it all contributes to that perception of attractiveness.
Yeah, it's like healthy skin is a visual cue that says, hey, I'm healthy on the inside too.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that studies show that even subtle improvements in skin homogeneity, like reducing blotchiness or unevenness, can make a face appear more attractive.
without people even consciously noticing what's changed, right?
Exactly. It happens on a subconscious level. And unlike some of those fixed facial features, skin health is more dynamic. It can change based on lifestyle, diet, and all sorts of things.
Now, when it comes to skin tone and complexion, we know there's a lot of cultural variation and preferences.
Definitely. There's a whole issue of colorism where lighter skin tones are often favored in many societies. But again, this is not universal. Some cultures prefer reddish or yellowish undertones, and there's a growing appreciation for the beauty of medium skin tones.
And features often seen in people of mixed race heritage, right?
Absolutely. And remember how we talked about the brightness of the whites of the eyes?
Yeah.
That can play a role in overall attractiveness, too. There's even some research suggesting that a bit of redness in the skin can be perceived as healthy and attractive. And interestingly, some studies suggest that men might place more emphasis on skin tone when judging attractiveness.
Huh. A potential gender difference there. Okay, one last thing on skin. What about that glow we associate with attractive people? The research mentions skin radiance.
Right, that natural luminosity.
Uh,
Studies have shown that faces with good radiance, especially on the cheeks and T-zone, are rated as more attractive and youthful. It might signal good hydration, health, and vitality.
like that healthy sheen that just draws you in. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the internal factors that influence attractiveness, specifically hormones and genetics.
So, starting with hormones. We know that sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen are responsible for those sexually dimorphic features we discussed earlier. Testosterone contributes to a more prominent jawline and cheekbones in men, while estrogen is linked to a smaller, lower face and fuller lips in women.
And that leads us to the fascinating hormonal theory of facial attractiveness.
Right, which suggests that our preferences for certain masculine or feminine features might actually change based on our own hormonal fluctuations. For example, some studies suggest that women might be more attracted to men with more masculine features during ovulation when fertility is highest.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. But the research mentioned that recent studies haven't always replicated this finding.
Yeah, it's still an active area of research, and it's not just about the hormones of the observer, right? There's also research on how an individual's own hormone levels relate to their perceived attractiveness. For example, lower testosterone to estradiol ratios in women have been linked to higher attractiveness ratings.
And then we have the whole genetic side of things, like, are we born with a predisposition to be seen as attractive?
It's looking more and more like genetics play a big role. Research is starting to identify specific genes associated with perceived beauty. And they've even found that different sets of genes might be linked to attractiveness in men versus women.
Like, specific genes for certain features.
It seems that way. For instance, in women, genes related to body mass have been linked to attractiveness, while in men, it's genes related to blood cholesterol levels.
Wow, that's getting down to the nitty-gritty. And how much of our attractiveness is actually determined by our genes?
Estimates for the heritability of facial attractiveness are generally between 0.50 and 0.70. And for facial masculinity, femininity, it's around zero point 0.4 to 0.50. So a pretty substantial chunk of the variation we see in attractiveness is due to our genes.
Which explains why some families just seem to have those good genes that make everyone look so striking.
Right, you definitely see familial resemblance in facial features and overall attractiveness. And the research also points out that this heritability of beauty could have some unfortunate societal consequences.
How so?
Well, if people who are perceived as more attractive tend to have more advantages in life, like getting better jobs or being treated more favorably, then those advantages could be passed down through generations, further entrenching inequalities.
That's a sobering thought. It's like beauty is not just about aesthetics. It can have real-world implications.
Oh, no.
Okay, moving on. We know that attractiveness isn't just about biology. Cultural influences play a huge role in shaping our beauty standards.
Absolutely. What's considered attractive can vary wildly across cultures and historical periods. Think about preferences for body size, skin tone, specific facial features. It's all over the map.
It's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but the beholder's eye is shaped by their culture.
Right, and there's research on ethnocentric biases, meaning we tend to find features that are common in our own cultural group more attractive. But with globalization and increased exposure to different cultures, our beauty standards are becoming more diverse.
So even though there might be some universal preferences based on things like symmetry and proportions, our cultural background still plays a huge role.
Exactly. And we can't ignore the impact of the media and the beauty industry. They bombard us with images that promote often narrow and unrealistic beauty standards.
It's like this constant pressure to conform to these idealized images.
And that can have a real impact on self-esteem and body image, especially with the rise of social media and all the filtered, perfected photos we see every day. Luckily, we're seeing movements like body positivity pushing back against those narrow standards and advocating for greater inclusivity.
It's about celebrating all types of beauty, which is a great step forward. Okay, for the last part of our deep dive, let's zoom in on the psychology of attraction. How do our own minds shape what we find attractive?
Well, our brains are full of cognitive biases that influence our perceptions, like the attractiveness halo effect. The halo effect. It's the tendency to see attractive people as more positive in other ways, too, like smarter, more competent, even more trustworthy.
Like if they're beautiful, they must be good.
Exactly. And remember cognitive averaging. It applies here, too. Our brains are drawn to faces that are close to the average of all the faces we've seen because they're familiar and easy to process.
Like our brains just prefer what's easy on the eyes. And the flip side of that is that we might unconsciously associate less attractive faces with negative traits.
It's called the ugly is bad effect, and unfortunately it's a real bias. And it's not just these general biases, right? Our own individual experiences and preferences also come into play, like the mere exposure effect, where the more we see a face, the more attractive we find it.
Familiarity breeds fondness, even with faces.
Right. And there's this idea of self-imprinting, where we might be drawn to faces that resemble ourselves or our parents.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
And then there's the cheerleader effect, where people appear more attractive in a group setting than individually. Even the visual environment we're exposed to can influence what we find attractive over time.
So our brains are constantly learning and updating what we find beautiful based on our experiences.
Yeah,
And it sounds like our own perceived attractiveness can also affect our psychological well-being.
definitely. Studies have shown that people who rate themselves as more attractive tend to have higher self-esteem and a more positive outlook. And they're often perceived by others as more positive and likable.
It's like a feedback loop, how we see ourselves and how others see us. Okay, for our final stop, let's talk about how technology is changing the way we study facial attractiveness.
Technology has opened up so many new possibilities. We have things like facial mapping software that can analyze faces in minute detail, creating composite faces, and even using algorithms to evolve more attractive faces based on human ratings.
So we can actually use technology to figure out what makes a face attractive.
To a certain extent, yes. And with techniques like geometric morphometrics, we can analyze the shapes of faces and how those shapes relate to attractiveness with incredible precision.
Wow, that's amazing. And what about artificial intelligence? Is that playing a role?
Absolutely. Deep neural networks are showing incredible potential in predicting attractiveness, often with greater accuracy than traditional methods. They can pick up on subtle patterns that we humans might miss.
Like AI is becoming a beauty expert. That's wild. What about brain imaging? How's that being used to study attraction?
Techniques like fMRI and EEG allow us to see what's happening in the brain in real time when someone looks at an attractive face. We can pinpoint the specific areas that light up and track the timing of those responses.
So we're literally getting a glimpse inside the brain to see what happens when we experience attraction.
That's amazing. And lastly, even facial recognition technology is adding to our understanding. There's some research suggesting that attractive faces might actually be recognized more accurately. Yeah, maybe because they capture our attention more easily or because our brains process them differently. It could also be related to distinctiveness, like how memorable a face is, or even perceived social status.
Wow, so many factors at play. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the science of facial attractiveness. It's clear that it's not just about subjective opinion, but a complex interplay of biology, psychology, culture, and even technology.
Absolutely. We've seen that there might be some universal preferences rooted in evolution, but our individual and cultural experiences also play a huge role in shaping what we find beautiful.
Which leads us to a final thought for our listeners. Given all that we've learned, how do you think a deeper understanding of facial attractiveness might impact your own life, your interactions with others, your self-perception, even the broader societal values we hold? It's definitely something to think about.
For sure, it's about recognizing the influence of both our innate responses and the cultural messages we're constantly bombarded with.
So much to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of facial attractiveness.
It's been a pleasure.